Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Firstpost here. I'm Rupha Ramani. And we start this week looking back at the Paris Olympics. Yes, that's right, the games that was. And it is apt because Paris is gearing up for another Olympics. The Paralympics scheduled to kick off on the 28th of August. But it is imperative to take note of what kind of an Olympics this was for India in particular. How have they fared and what lessons will they want to take forward from here? Can India win medals in double-digit figures, become a competition to dominant countries like China and USA? And can they become an Olympic host? I caught up with someone very, very special just a few days back, an Olympic gold medal winner, to decode Mission Paris. Hit or miss? But it's not often that you're joined by a gold medalist, an individual gold medal Olympic champion, one who I watched strike gold live. It is my utmost privilege to invite Abhinav Bindra here. Thank you so much for giving us your time, Abhinav.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we all heard your speech. How was that special? How special was that moment, in fact, being recognized by the IOC?
No, it was a fantastic honor, a great honor of my life to be honored with the Olympic Order, the highest recognition of the Olympic movement. Yeah, and it is very humbling. You know, I've been working quite hard in the last few years in terms of trying to further the mission of the Olympic movement, not just as in my role as on the IOC Athletes Commission, but also through various initiatives, which my foundation has started here in India, which have become quite large in terms of scale. For example, our Olympic Values Education program is impacting close to 10 million children in 2 states, and we are working hard to even further that, to really create a culture for the Olympics at a grassroots level, to get kids physically active, to get kids physically literate. I think that's a very, very important aspect of even elite sporting performance. So it's been a very gratifying project to have dedicated a lot of time and effort to in the course of the last couple of years.
Yeah, but getting back to the games here, and that's what we're here to decode the Paris Olympics, particularly India's campaign. First off, Abhinav, if I had to ask you to choose one of the following words to sum up India's campaign, which one would it be? Happy, retrospective, or disappointed?
No, I'm not disappointed. I'm an athlete conditioned, which was conditioned with hope. So I remain hopeful. I would consider the Olympics in Paris to be a mixed bag of sorts for India. I think our athletes did very well. I think the one thing we have to acknowledge that the performances of our Olympic team was probably the best ever, in the sense that we were more competitive, you know, in a wide variety of disciplines. Our athletes showed a good fight, and that also is success, by the way. It may not have translated into medals as yet, but has there been progress made? Definitely there has been progress made, and I think we must all firstly acknowledge that. Has that translated onto the medals tally and onto the medals table? Obviously, not as much as we expected it to. I mean, with a little bit of luck, we could have had a few more going our way. Sure. But I think on the whole, I think we all thought that this was a time where we could perhaps reach double digits. And obviously the path was there to actually get it. But that is sport, and you know, that is how Olympic sport is all about. Within the Olympic Games, it's an extremely, extremely competitive event. It is fiercely competed. I mean, it is really, athletes are at the edge of human performance, and it is incredibly difficult to get there on the podium. So I think our athletes did well. Our athletes were well supported through their journey to Paris. I think we all acknowledge that there has been a lot of good work which has happened by the government as well, to support elite athletes, to make sure that they are well taken care of, not just a few months prior to the Games, but consistently through their journey. And I think looking ahead, what is important is to learn. Sport is always about learning. Sport is always about trying to get better, not just athletes, but the entire system. And I think that is what we should reflect back on, is that how do we get better? How do we move the needle from where we are to the next level? What has gone well? We must acknowledge that. What could be improved on? We should also acknowledge that and try and get better on those aspects. So that is how I really look at it. Yeah, it is in terms. I did say it's a mixed bag because I think we're a large country, and we don't like to see our country win many more medals because definitely the potential is definitely there.
You know, you speak about taking forward the positives, acknowledging what went right, and also acknowledging what went wrong. So what was it, according to you? What needs to be done?
Well, I don't know, frankly, in the sense that I'm not involved in day-to-day performance of athletes. I'm not there involved in day-to-day coordination. So for me to say something is as good as being an armchair critic. But I think I can only make some larger points here, which are, I think, in terms, I think there can be always better fine-tuning. I think, Indian sport is also complicated in nature because there are so many stakeholders involved. There is the government, there is the Sports Authority of India, there is the National Olympic Committee, the IOA, there are your national federations, there are private enterprises, foundations working directly with athletes. So there are many touch points that an athlete has, which sometimes makes things complicated. And I think perhaps it's time to ensure even a higher degree of coordination.
Yeah.
Perhaps that already happened and we've improved on it even in Paris, but how can we even do that better? How do we set clear protocols in place in terms of, who's going to be there with the athlete at an Olympic Games? Because we all know that, when you go to a multi-sporting discipline event like the Olympics, the ratio of support staff, the ratio of coaches is always going to be limited. Yeah. But those are aspects which have a very direct influence on performance. But how do we set protocols? How do we set SOPs well in advance so that all stakeholders know what is in store? And that must be adhered to. So I think a little bit of better coordination on those aspects. Again, I'm just only somebody from the outside and trying to make those points here.
But Abhinav, you are a stakeholder in this whole process of India when it comes to a global sporting competitor. How do you see the country, or how should the country move forward from here?
I think on the larger picture, I think if you were to ask me, and that's where really I can answer and maybe focus on, it would be, more appropriate if I make those points because, I think what is important is, everybody says we're 1.4 billion in population, the world's largest population. But I think the most important question we all have to ask is, what is the playing population of India? And my understanding or my assumption would be that it is substantially, it's a very low number. And I think that is something that we need to change and we need to really focus on and really focus on sports' larger role that it can play towards nation building. I think so far how we see sport is that, sport is great. Our athletes should go out there and win medals, and that enhances the image of the country. Of course, it makes us all proud. It makes us all happier as citizens. It makes us all stand taller. No doubt about it, and that focus has to continue. However, I think we'll be missing a large point if we really don't see the larger role sport can play in nation building. I'll give you a few examples. We have to make sport more mainstream in policy across the board in India. How can sport play a more meaningful role in making India a healthier country, for example? We're a young population, but are we the healthiest population in the world? I don't know. I'm not an expert, but can sport play a more meaningful role there to make our citizens, the young citizens, more physically active, more physically literate, because that has a direct correlation on health. And so how do we ensure sport comes into to health policy? And that's important because that then also you start focusing on access to play. You start focusing on access to community sport, into community infrastructure, which allows people to enjoy sport for the sheer joy of playing sport. Then in education, I think that is another very, very critical aspect. How do we mainstream sport more in education?
Right.
And again, I think so far we've only focused on how do we win medals. I think that's been but how can sport play a more meaningful role in shaping our young society?
Yeah.
Probably a very young demographic. There is no better role that sport can play in terms of building character of young people. Sport teaches us so much. The learnings on the field of play is probably the greatest life lessons our young boys and girls can ever get, which will hold them in good stead in anything that they do in life. So from a values perspective, how can sports role really be to make sure that young India imbibes these wonderful values that sport has to offer? Then in terms of so many other aspects, gender equality, I think we have so many things that we do to empower women and girls, but sport can play a wonderful role there in terms of breaking glass ceilings. Whenever an athlete does well, she becomes role model in this country and inspires so many girls to dream, inspires so many girls to believe, and break so many societal norms and glass ceilings to be the best that they can be and to dream big. So, aspects of that. Then there are so many aspects of infrastructure development in India now in terms of building smart cities. How do we ensure sport is mainstream there in terms of ensuring every smart city has an aspect of community sport, has an aspect of building certain infrastructure for general people in terms of community sport, because that is the foundation of sport anywhere in the world, community sport. And I think that there needs to be a greater emphasis all around. When that happens, sport will be talked about everywhere.
Yes.
But all this development that needs to happen at the grassroots level, at the foundation level, is critical. If we ever have to have ambitions of winning 30 medals, 40 medals, it's not, the current model is never going to get us there. Our current model will have a point of where it can't really grow more, maybe 15 medals, maybe a little bit more. But after that, it'll saturate this current model because you only have so many athletes. You have only so many players of a certain level. But how do you broad base it? So, and this will take time. There is no easy fix.
That leads me to the next question, because you've covered so many points in there. So I have to look a little ahead. I know you're tired with people, speaking to you about this, asking you this, but pragmatically asking you. Do you think how long will it take for India to bridge that gap? Do you see India bridging that gap between themselves and, say, dominant countries like China and USA?
Easy example is Los Angeles. I mean, you run an important publication or platform which is sport. You probably already know who our athletes will be in LA. You have certain members who will be from the team from Paris, certain members who are your juniors at the moment. You probably know all of them. And maybe there will be 10 more surprises that you've not heard of. But generally, you know the ecosystem already. You know your contenders already, your hopefuls already. So how many hopefuls do we have is the question that I would like to raise. I don't know. Do you know how many hopefuls do we have for LA? Maybe 300-400?
Very tough to say that. 4 years is a long time.
No, I'm not even saying the people who would qualify. I'm just saying that people who could have an outside chance to get there. It will be an interesting number to reflect on.
But you did mention LA 2028. We have to touch upon that too. Cricket in the Olympics for the very first time, does it work?
Well, I think, one thing what is very interesting about the Olympic movement historically is that it has remained extremely relevant to changing times. If you see the Olympic program has been very dynamic in nature. You saw breaking in Paris. You saw sport climbing, which is quite interesting, skateboarding, and the Olympic program has kept itself very relevant to the youth, and cricket obviously has captured the imagination of a large number of people across the world. In terms of the amount of people who watch this sport. I mean, of course, it's predominantly from the subcontinent, but the subcontinent in itself is how many billion people. So it is very hard for it to not keep that into consideration. Of course, it will be very interesting to see how the sport develops. I think it's only the second time. I mean, in contemporary history, we can even say it's the first real time in contemporary sport that it's been part of it. I think the Olympics have to remain a very prestigious event for the cricketing fraternity. I think that is important. If it ends up being something like a certain other sports where it is important for nations, but they would rather choose a World Cup over cricket, over the Olympics, then the prestige kind of drops down, and I really hope that doesn't happen. It's to be seen how it develops, but I'm sure that because I think in LA there will be only 6 odd teams competing at LA, so I'm sure that it will be 6 of the best national teams competing. A lot of the other nations who would probably qualify. The Olympics is very embedded in their culture, in their country, say in Australia or the UK. It is really embedded in their society, and the importance that they give to the Olympics is massive. So I'm quite confident that it will be a very competitive tournament, for a competitive event, with all their teams putting their absolute best foot forward.
You have spoken about, during this conversation, you did speak about how Olympics truly tests an athlete, Abhinav, which leads me to this question of, Vinesh Phogat. Very heartbreaking, yes, you saw it up close, but what's the biggest learning from this episode?
Well, of course, it was heartbreaking. There's a human side of it, and it was heartbreaking to see her go through it. She's a very resilient individual. She's gone through a lot on and off the field of play. She did magnificently, and then to wake up that next morning and to realize that she's been disqualified it's obviously painful, and it is an extremely heartbreaking moment. But when you keep emotion aside, and I think to be able to, it's also at some point of time you have to keep emotion aside if you want to reflect. I mean, at the end of the day, the rules stand very clear in sport. I mean, if there are no rules, you can argue the rules are good or bad. That is something that's a fair argument where to have. But when you are at a starting point and you signed off on a set of rules which are to be enforced equally for all, then it becomes almost impossible to kind of get any relief from that. And that was very clear that there is no zero tolerance for that. It very clearly mentioned that there will be 2 weigh-ins. So from that perspective, it is what it is. What the sport of wrestling does going forward, that is another question to be asked. Again, I'm not an expert in wrestling. They probably made these rules with a certain thought process as well, I'm sure they have their own perspective on why they've made these rules. So I think it is important to understand every side of the story. But of course, from an athlete to an athlete, from a human to another human, is the most heartbreaking moment we all encountered. And she's a great athlete. She has all our respect, and then I hope she is able to recover out of this very heartbreaking moment. This is not easy to come out of, and frankly, nobody can do it for you. It is only time which can be a healer. I hope that through the passage of time, she finds some motivation again to try and compete again. But again, it's really up to her.
That's right. It's been that was one friction point. One of those moments that came out from the games for India. But if I had to ask you to look back at that campaign and sum up, what was probably the biggest positive that India can take away from it? What would that be for you, Abhinav?
No, I won't name any of the 6 individuals who ended up with medals. They're all heroes, they've done magnificently. But I think the biggest positive was 2 counts. I think our athletes on the whole were far more competitive than ever. I haven't seen an Olympic team from India being so competitive around. Does that stop us? The next question is that good enough? Probably not.
Yeah.
But you also have to acknowledge what has gone well. All around, I think the athletes' general performance in terms of competitiveness across wide disciplines was great, and then was more competitive than ever before. I think what was also very interesting to see and gratifying to see was just the general interest that the Olympics are generating. I think it's fair to say that we are no longer a one-sport nation.
Right, but since you mentioned this about athletes giving it their all and fighting hard, and that's this edition saw that. I have to put this by you. I have to pit you here against someone like Prakash Chopras, who right after the game said he felt a lot of the players didn't step up when they really had to. What are your thoughts? Do you agree with that?
Appreciate his perspective. I'm not saying that what he said is anything wrong. I mean, I think there are 2 elements to it. I think one element is that sport can never be scripted. There is going to be always there's always going to be an element of gray in terms of getting the job done. Having said that, I agree with him that accountability is important. It's absolutely critical, and athletes too need to be accountable, as with everybody else. I think when we go out there, it is a team, and I think everybody involved is part of that team, and you win collectively and you lose collectively. So I think there's always a time to reflect back.
Yeah.
There is always a time to improve. And I think that time is now. Now that the dust has settled on Paris is history. Hopefully this is the last conversation that I'm having on Paris, because I think focus must now shift to LA.
Yes.
And that's the beauty of the Olympic movement and the Olympic cycle. One gets over, and
True.
There are Olympic dreams already taking flight the very next hour. So I think the time to reflect is now in terms of everybody involved, whether it be coaches, whether it be the athletes, whether it be the sports staff, whether it be organizations. I think everybody has to take stock, and everybody has to take this collective responsibility on things that have gone well and on things that can be done better. And I think the time for that process is now, and hopefully that will happen.
I have to wrap up, and I can't stop myself from asking you this. One of the biggest stars from the Olympics, of course, was undoubtedly Turkey's Yusuf Dikec. The kind of impact he's had, one of the coolest customers there, and the kind of influence he's had across sporting disciplines. Did you get to watch him, and did you get to meet him?
No, I think it was great for the sport of shooting, for the sport of shooting, which has kind of struggled to be mainstreamed. It was also not being held in Paris. It was being held in Chateauroux, which was difficult. But I think every sport requires heroes, and I think every sport requires characters. That's what makes sport so interesting for people to follow. And it was great to see that happening through him. as a shooter, I didn't really understand what was happening. It was quite normal because many athletes are like that in terms of at least pistol or some will not have equipment. Majority have their hand in their pocket. We're a cool bunch of people. The world is just realizing it now.
Of course, Abhinav, I have to take your word for that. From one shooter to another, you set the cool standard way back in 2008. But thank you so much. It's been quite the pleasure speaking to you. A lot of thought-provoking points there from you.
Thank you so much.
Some very, very poignant and thought-provoking conversation that. Some very valid points that Abhinav Bindra made there and something to look back at and take forward too. Well, that does it here on First Sports here. Hope you enjoyed this very special edition. Of course, regular programming continues as always, where we bring you more updates and news from the world of sports. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.
Climate change is on our doorstep. It's time for a revolution to take root. And it starts with 1.4 billion Indians. It starts with one tree for humanity, one tree for Mother Earth, one tree for our future. Project One Tree, a News 18 network initiative.
Across continents, one powerful news source.
Bringing you diverse perspectives on the issues that matter.
We go beyond the boundaries to give you that little extra about every sporting moment.
So thank you for making Firstpost 5 million strong. We're counting on your support, and you can trust us to bring you the news unfiltered and unvarnished.
On the show today, the T20 World Cup bandwagon has moved across to the West Indies,